Hi,
Hi,
Michael.
everyone.
How are you today?
So, doing well, all things considered. Great to see you.
Good. Well, thank you so much for joining us for this conversation. I've known Michael for many years, and his title belies the fact that he's an expert in almost everything. I think I've had conversations with Michael over the years about everything from robotics and artificial intelligence to the rise of China to more recently the intersection of science and technology. But today we're going to talk about the future of work. And I wanted to start, Michael, with I think the most obvious thing that people in the room are probably witnessing and experiencing for themselves, which is the shift to working at home. We've seen a couple of large technology companies, Twitter and Shopify in particular, basically declare that if employees are able to work from home and wish to work from home, they can do so permanently. Is this indicative in your research of a broader trend, or are we seeing a wholesale shift among companies, particularly tech companies, to a different kind of working model?
I think it's a terrific question, and first of all, this COVID crisis has caused a lot of changes, some of which we described as accelerations, and some of them as reversals. I think previous to this crisis, we certainly saw an increase in the use of collaboration technologies, more distributed teams, and in fact the potential to work from home. First of all, I should mention, right? I mean, I think someone quite wise said, 40% of us can work from home, and we've discovered the other 60% should really be paid a lot more, right? I mean, these are truly the essential workers, aren't knowledge workers who have the opportunity and privilege to work from home. But that said, those of us who are able to, and quite frankly, in many cases, have been forced to because of the health conditions. It does come into question, how much of it snaps back. Let's say we have effective therapy or a vaccine, and I think it won't go completely back to what it was before. So I think it is an acceleration in distributed teams. On the other hand, it is a bit of a reversal too, because as you've documented as a journalist, as well, as much as the technology enables us to be global and worldwide, we have seen these agglomerations in places like the Bay Area where I am today, or New York, and the old two pizza model, right? That nothing important gets done by more than the number of people that can be fed by two pizzas, and they're usually physically co-located. So I think this does open up more possibilities into this idea of reversals, right? I mean, even living conditions, are people going to work from home? Is home going to be in a large urban center? We're seeing there's early signals of real estate demand farther out, either in suburbs or exurbs, or literally in other states. And so I think we will, if we take the longer view, we're going to see more distribution in terms of where people work and more people working from home. But I think we'll still see, when it's safe, people wanting to get back together again physically.
I know that here at the Asia Society event and outside of the Asia Society event, there's a major conversation about inclusion going on in this country and in other countries. Do you have a take on whether distributed work is good for inclusion or bad for inclusion? I've heard it argued both ways. I've heard it argued that when you're on a Zoom call, there's no hierarchy. The grid of photos on that Zoom call doesn't know who the boss is and doesn't know who the lowest paid worker is on that call. It's random. But I've also heard people argue that you really do start to see the inequities show up if someone lives in a rural area where they don't have good broadband, or someone lives in an urban area and they don't have access to the same level of technology. What are your thoughts on whether or not a work from home and distributed workforce, how do we make sure that stays inclusive?
Yeah, I mean, I think your observation and your reflections are exactly right, that it isn't all that simple. There are really interesting and in some cases tragic stories about education, not literally only the digital divide as to whether or not a student has broadband access at home. I mean, I saw a statistic recently here in San Francisco, something like 5,000 elementary school students don't have connectivity to actually study from home. But then you come to these questions about, what shows up in your background, right? And if you don't have a virtual background, it's a very different situation, depending on the living conditions you're living in. And so, you might have the same amount of square centimeters on a screen, but what's shown behind you could be very, very different. And so I think in some cases it can exacerbate, or at least it doesn't get rid of all of the inequities. And in other cases, as we've seen in other technologies, it can put you on a somewhat equal playing field in terms of you can have as many screen inches as your colleague. So I think it is complicated. I think to your question about what will it take to create more inclusivity, in many cases I think the types of things that are important, even in a work from home environment, are in many cases the same things which were true if we're in the same physical space, whether it's around mentorship and sponsorship, understanding language. If you're talking about racial inequities, particularly, developing competencies to be able to talk about these things, to be able to deal with a charged racial situation and work through it together. All of those things I think continue to be true, but in some cases they require adaptation. We know, for instance, the ways in which information spreads online, perhaps less so on the video, in the live video sense, but in the recorded video sense, they do take additional dynamics, and misinformation, disinformation, and their corporate equivalents are also true. And so I think trying to think through things like recommendation engines, think through, what affordances you put into the technology, so that in fact you increase inclusion, increase diversity, rather than make our workplaces a less inclusive place.
I think we'll have an opportunity to come back to inclusivity in a moment. Michael, you also raised the issue of education. Let's talk a little bit about what this particular pandemic has meant for future generations as they think about what to study, what they should be focusing on. Are we starting to see a conversation among educators and young people about where the jobs are going to be in the future, whether they're distributed or not?
Yeah, I think this is a place where there's acceleration, and there was a conversation previously, which I think was a very important one, and it's not going away. In some of our research we've been documenting, and some of the coverage you've been, also editing and making sure that it gets out there, is the impact of automation, the impact of artificial intelligence, robotics, and all of those types of technologies. And that's, a multi-decade story. And so, to a certain extent, you say, well, the pandemic doesn't have anything to do with that. On the other hand, we do see some acceleration in the deployments of some of these technologies, partly for economic reasons, but in some cases for health and safety reasons. Again, a robot is actually not going to contract the coronavirus, for instance, and you can create more distancing if you don't need as many people in one facility. And so I think a lot of that conversation continues forward, but in some cases on an accelerated basis. And what does that say, for instance? Well, some of the skills that we believe will be in demand going forward, clearly there'll be a lot and continue to be in the technology space, right? Another place that you've covered, if you're an artificial intelligence specialist, if you're a robotics expert, you have a bright future in terms of your career trajectories. And quite frankly, everyone will have to raise their digital skills. But the other thing, and this comes back a little bit to the discussion about inclusion as well. Some of the things that machines don't do all that well, being able to interact with another person, to have emotional intelligence, to have creativity, to be able to inspire other people, whether it's through video or the written word, and particularly a distributed work group or team. Those are skills which will be in increasing demand in the future. And that set of meta skills around adaptability, grit, resilience. For certain, we're all being tested. The previous panel was about managing stress. Those types of skills, this won't be the last pandemic. This won't be the last disruptive recession or, economic dislocation that happens. And so we're all going to have to, try to develop all of those types of skills. And we typically don't take classes in those, but they are things that are learnable. And so I think being able to provide our workers and, quite frankly, our children in education, the ability to develop these skills will be incredibly important going forward.
Yeah. Do you find, I found that before the pandemic, we were starting to hear executives at corporations and technologists at large organizations really engage in a conversation about how to meaningfully and carefully help their employees manage those transitions, whether it was the factory workers and manufacturing employees that might need to be retrained or reskilled in order to take new jobs in the organization as automation absorbed some of the manufacturing jobs, or at a higher level, really starting to think about an ethical framework for deploying AI. And then it felt like everybody just sort of had to hit pause because of the much more urgent need to sort of protect employees and think about how they're going to operate through the pandemic. Are we starting to see conversations, those thoughtful conversations, get revived, or when does that happen?
I think the broad answer is yes. Let me take it at the higher level, which is, if you look at Business Roundtable's statement, if you look at a number of different anecdotes, to be frank, but I heard a CEO, for instance, say, look, that person's spending about 50% of their time on ESG types of things. The recognition, and in fact, this incredible moment with regard to race in America right now, business has had to address. And I think what we're seeing here is an increasing recognition of the role of business in broader society. And so whether it is about, what responsibility do I have to our workers in a corporation, even if tomorrow or the next month or the next day or the next year, they're working for somebody else other than us. How do I make sure that they can continue to be productive members of society so that, they might buy our products and services or, our customers' products and services down the road? How do we ensure we have increasing productivity around the world? Particularly in a place like the United States, where because of aging and quite frankly, Asian society, if you think about it, China as well, the demographics are going to be a tremendous drag on economic growth because of aging, basically. A large, roughly half of the economic growth that we've seen in the past half century have come about because we have more workers and because, our family sizes are decreasing. We simply won't have enough workers to have the type of economic growth that we had before. So we need to increase productivity. Well, the way you increase productivity is by having better trained workers and deploying technology which workers will now have to use. And so those investments are incredibly important, investments in human capital. And so we do see, I think, that entire set of issues, whether it's how you can be more inclusive in the workplace, how can you make sure you invest in workers, how you invest in education. I think we do see more and more forward-thinking business leaders engaged in those conversations and, quite frankly, taking actions, which I think is very, very positive.
Right. So I guess I want to dig a little bit more and get your take on what's working. And I imagine that there are people on this call who are themselves thinking about how do I reskill? How do I make sure that I am able to take advantage of the next wave of technology, that I don't get sort of locked out of change? Where are we seeing either organizations or programs or individuals doing a good job of making that transition from sort of early 21st century skills to what you're going to need to be successful in the future?
Well, I've described it as one of the grand challenges of the next few decades, and described it as a challenge because I think in some ways, certainly at scale, it's unsolved. That we don't necessarily know how to do that. As much as we wish K through 12 could be better, and I think we all think that it could be better. In fact, if you look in the investments in any large American city in K through 12 and compare it to the investments for people's training in the 20s, 30s, 40s, and 50s, it is it's a small the investment in the rest of life is a small fraction of what we. And by the way, I don't think we should disinvest from our children. What I'm saying is we need to continue to invest going forward. I think for an individual person, and particularly I suspect for many people who are, in this program, people are in many cases quite fortunate to be able to be more self-directed, and the amount of material which is available, either for free on YouTube or elsewhere, or you can put down a credit card online and be able to do that. For those of us who have the privilege to do that, there are huge amounts of opportunities there. I think the question is, for broader society, how do we make sure we invest? I think it is important to understand which direction technology is moving in. Because in many cases, those will be the enablers for all of us to be successful. And I think those meta skills that I mentioned before, which I think there are fewer online courses about, seeking those, I think, would be incredibly important for all of us. And by the way, it might not be courses, right? I mean, there are other professionals who can help all of us in our mental health, for instance. If you go back to the panel that just preceded this one. But those are the kinds of things which those of us who have the privileges of being able to direct our time, can invest in our own development. I guess the one other thing I should mention is, as we make choices about where we choose to work, or for those who want to be entrepreneurs, the question of which companies actually make part of their value proposition, the investments that they're making in improving the skills and abilities of their workers. I think that'll be an important part in addition to what you take home in the bank account.
Yeah, and that is interesting. We've been covering the way that companies are being more responsive to the needs of particularly younger employees who've really driven this conversation around sustainability. They've driven the conversation around purpose. Have yet to really hear a lot of employees clamoring for sort of lifelong learning, upskilling, but I can see that being something that as those young employees get more mature and start to think about the second half of their careers, this may be something that they're going to add to their wish list. We have some questions coming in from our audience, and so I'm going to try to get to a couple of those before we have to say goodbye. One of our members asks, with so many people working remotely now and companies seeming to support that new working environment, aren't we losing the importance and benefits of actual human interaction? What does that mean for us as a global community, professionally and personally?
Well, number one, I do think this is real interaction. I feel like I'm interacting with you, Stephanie. So that's one. But to take your the questioner's question in the spirit it was offered, I do think that there is value in seeing people face to face. From a pure reductionist, scientific view, right? I mean, there are many types of cues, many types of information that you get from seeing someone in person, which, even a sophisticated video conference system, makes it harder for you to do so. So yes, I do think you lose something when you don't see someone in person, but I think it is a set of trade-offs, right? I mean, one of the things, if you think about business travel, for some of us, we'd get on a plane for many, many hours, spend a very short amount of time, in our meeting, and then, fly. We might spend more time on airplanes than we do actually interacting productively somewhere else. That has environmental impacts. It has all kinds of impacts, on our families and all those sorts of things. And so then, we now have more choices about whether or not we're going to choose to get on the airplane, or do something from video. So I think there are times when it, will be worthwhile to, get a group of people together. Absolutely. And so I think what we now have is we've expanded our portfolio of options, and I think that's a good thing. And I think over time we're going to, make choices, and hopefully wise choices about when we're going to use this technology, when we're going to use. Lots of people are getting Zoom fatigue, and not just it's not the only tool out there, right? But I spend all my time on video. It's not bad to turn off the camera every once in a while and just talk with somebody, so that you don't have to look like you had you combed your hair or put on the right clothes or whatever. Yeah. So I think I tried to comb my hair today, but yeah.
We appreciate it. Well, it's interesting because I feel like, as you said, this feels like real interaction, but you and I have met before. We have had a chance to break bread. We've had a few phone conversations in the intervening years. So the rapport that we have is aided by that in-person interaction that we've had heretofore. I reported on an interesting phenomenon that, and have been doing a couple of panels about companies, innovation companies that have been fundraising for venture capital during the pandemic. And when you talk about environments where you want to be in person, I talked to a venture capitalist who did pull the trigger on an investment in a company where he had not met the founders. And it was very unusual because, especially in an early round, you're betting on the person as much as you are the idea. And it was really interesting to understand how he got his head around the idea of making an investment in an investor that he had only interacted with in this fashion, that, they hadn't gone for long walks or breakfasts or, cocktails. It was much more arm's length. And I imagine that the really good investments will get funded in that environment, but the ones that are marginal, where you really sort of need to see the person and experience their excitement firsthand, those are the ones that are going to be tricky to fund.
Yeah, I think the old adage used to be. Oh, I'm sorry. The old adage used to be, video conference was good for sustaining relationships, but not for forming them. To your previous point. But I do think the aperture is opening. To the story that you reported on, we do see more and more of these relationships that are starting in this mode, and I think it's surprising how it can work. And so I think there's, again, just to the point about opening the aperture. I think we're starting to see more and more of that.
Right. One of our members asked the question, what does the future of work look like in terms of being able to work anywhere in the world? Are we seeing people actually physically relocate to other parts of the world? I have a number of employees who've gone home to their parents' houses as a place to work, but they've not left the country. Are we seeing people say, this is my chance to work in London, or this is my chance to live in Asia?
Oh, we definitely are. I think, our experience has been similar. When we talk with other companies, we do see folks, as you said, literally, I need to be with my parents and shelter with them, for instance, during this time, be able to support them. People taking the opportunity to move to different places. And so I think it was possible before, but now, it caused, it's one thing to say it was possible. It's another thing to actually see it happen. And I think one of the interesting questions is, what happens when the health requirement for the shelter-in-place orders, for instance, goes away? How much do things, in quotes, go back to the way they were? And I think that's going to be very, very local decisions, and not just geographically local, but local to different organizations and their own culture. And economics comes into play. I mean, we've seen some companies make announcements, which seem to suggest, if you work at a lower cost place, you shouldn't be paid as much as you were paid when you were working at a higher cost place. And I think those are the types of choices that companies are going to have to make, and employees are going to look at that and make their own decisions as well.
Right. Michael, do you have a take, or can you share some facts around what we think COVID-19 or the pandemic may mean for immigration and international workers here in the United States? Obviously, this is a little bit of a moving target with various policies, but in general, I mean, these are a lot of the companies that you and I write about, the fast-growing technology companies, do depend on an influx of international workers for innovation as much as anything else. Is that going to grind to a halt because people aren't going to want to travel?
Well, it's a terrific question. I mean, I think this is one of the accelerations of a recent reversal to a certain extent, which is, the globalization, people moving around the world, goods and services moving around the world. And, suddenly, within a matter of weeks and months, we see what decoupling means. We see what that all being shut down means. As you know from your reporting as well, right? I mean, about 50% of the Fortune 500 was founded or co-founded by either foreign-born or first-generation immigrant. The same thing is true of these unicorn tech startups. And so immigration for the United States has been a tremendous source of innovation, jobs, new entrepreneurial activity. You could argue people who move have already, they've demonstrated some entrepreneurial spirit, and so we see that. And I think the extent to which, disease or policy keeps that from happening is certainly to the United States' detriment.
In terms of, the technological infrastructure needed to support more distributed working, we know that's where we started the conversation. Are we starting to see an acceleration in the investments in digital transformation? It does feel like a lot of companies have been talking about digital transformation for the better part of a decade. And yet I sometimes feel like we're still in the first couple of innings of that full transformation. Where are we in your mind on that spectrum? And again, will this environment we find ourselves in serve as an accelerant to helping either companies with their own internal systems make that transition, or, in the case of brick and mortar retailers, for example, really accelerate their move to e-commerce?
Yeah, this has been one of the things that has accelerated in the COVID crisis. Now, that said, I think we're early. Two things. One, we're early in the overall story of digital transformation, and two is that there's a tremendous dispersion in terms of individual companies as to how far they are. But that said, even the companies that are far along think that there's so much more that they could do. But yeah, if you look at any of the statistics in terms of digitization, whether it's how much is coming, how many orders are coming through e-commerce or omni-channel channels, right? If a company is not seeing double-digit percentage increases that are coming through those channels, they're losing share, during this crisis. And ironically, while the crisis has been very difficult for some companies, to take airlines for instance, who have seen huge drops in passenger volume. We know some airlines are taking this opportunity when website and mobile transactions are lower to accelerate all the back end work, which otherwise to use the analogy of changing the engines on a plane while it's flying for an airline, it is easier to do when you have lower volumes on your system. So we do see this as an opportunity that some companies are taking to accelerate their process of digital transformation.
Yeah. And then in terms of the ability of, we are seeing a number of companies, as you said, the airlines are just one example of industries that, where we're really starting to see the winners and the losers start to emerge. Certainly in retail and in restaurants, we're starting to see closures and bankruptcies. As somebody who looks at innovation and who looks at the role that technology can play in the evolution of business, are we seeing a permanent shift in the ways that people will engage and the ways that consumers will behave? Or are these companies that are going away going to be replaced by something completely different that's more innovative? In other words, is the pie shrinking, or is the pie going to stay the same? It's just going to be replaced with different flavors of pie, I guess.
Well, if we invest in people, if we invest in technology, we invest in process innovations, hopefully we'll continue to increase productivity and the economic pie will grow. Different questions about distribution of that. So I think that hopefully will be true. But we do see transformations. Some incumbents are not only going to survive, but they'll thrive because they are going through this process of digital transformation, whether it's in how they interact with customers or, what they do, in the back of house, right? Whether it's supply chain, logistics, operations, all of those things that you need in order to run a successful corporation, those are becoming digitized as well. At the same time, as you said, there are also disruptive new companies that are coming up, and they will displace some of the older ones as well. And so this process of Schumpeterian creative destruction, it should and hopefully will continue. And I think the other thing we need to do is how do we care for workers, while this is all happening? In the long term, our creative destruction has been good for people raising living standards, but we need that to continue, and that'll be the product of our choices, product of our choices in business and a product of our choices as a society, through public policy.
Right. New question from the audience. The question is, given the new normal, and even when we go back to some semblance of normalcy in the coming months, how can we as individuals prepare for what might be in store for us in a post-COVID workplace?
Yeah, I mean, number one is to try to understand what the new normal and next normal will be. And, I think Yogi Berra says, the difficult thing about forecasts is that they're about the future. So you can't actually know what the future is, but try to have an understanding of what the potential scenarios might be. That's, number one, right? Just try to understand. By the way, that's, how businesses might change, et cetera, but how technology might change as well. And then, figure out your own path forward there. And again, many of us are privileged to be able to spend some time, retraining and educating ourselves, and being purposeful about doing that, I think, is helpful. And then, that's everything from, the formal technical skills, but, our own mental health, our resilience, all those sorts of things are, those underpin our ability to do anything else. And so we'll need to invest in those too.
Right. Michael, you talked about the importance of technology skills and how somebody who's an expert in AI or robotics would have plenty of work to keep them busy for years to come. You've recently done a major study about the intersection of science, specifically biotech and technology, and biology and technology. And I wonder if you can just, in our time left, talk a little bit about careers in healthcare and pharma and science. All eyes these days are on this sector. Are we seeing a surge in interest or some opportunities for people who heretofore had thought, I really want a career in Silicon Valley? Are they saying, maybe I should really be dedicating my intelligence and my gifts to finding the next vaccine, to preventing the next pandemic?
Well, certainly one thing that COVID-19 has revealed to us is the power of biology. In this case, is a negative power to truly affect our economy, and it has increased the interest in biology. All of us sort of feel like we're amateur epidemiologists and amateur virologists, et cetera, as we try to learn about this disease and how it might be cured or prevented. And so interest has increased. But I think, as you mentioned before, the interesting thing that we found in our research, you can find it on McKinsey.com for free, as it turns out, but it's the convergence of previous biology, molecular biology, and technology. So data, AI, those things have come together, and that's why some of these technologies in biology are, in fact, increasing faster than Moore's law in their development. And that's what's underpinning not only our ability to treat disease, but our ability to produce materials, our ability to change the course of agriculture. And so we do see increases in the interest on these topics, but it is a convergence, of information technologies, biological technologies, and we do know demand is going to increase. That demographic trend I mentioned before in aging, we will need more healthcare. Now we need to figure out how to pay for it. The United States is a particular problem here, but around the world, we do see, disease isn't going away, aging is not going away. And this isn't the last pandemic that we're going to see. And so, whether it's public health, epidemiology, molecular biology, or AI, all these things are coming together in a way, unless we're healthy, we can't get any of the other things done that we want to get done.
Yeah, it was interesting because I remember probably, again, 5 or 10 years ago, everyone was saying that, every company is a technology company. Goldman Sachs isn't a financial services company, it's a technology company. And that every young person would really need to learn how to code. I wonder if you think there's an equivalent conversation, maybe not around how every company is a biology company, but your study, which I thought was really interesting, didn't just look at the intersection of, I'm going to use Silicon Valley as a stand-in for information technology, but it was infotech plus biology. But also you looked at how biology was transforming the food business, how biology was transforming manufacturing. I mean, there is something about the natural world that is an amazing proxy for so many other organizations.
I think that's absolutely right. And the previous comment about, what do we need to do to prepare for the work of the future? I think we do have to understand which trends will be impactful. And, while we say, biology isn't necessarily going to be a direct impact on every industry, we think at least if you take into account the upstream and downstream impacts of biology, then it will affect the entire economy. If you think of a life insurance company, if lifespans change significantly as a result of some of these implications, that's going to change that industry, the actuarial assumptions in that industry. And so we do think, if you think about what's the base level of knowledge, you need to be an effective business professional going forward. Increasingly, knowing something about biology, in addition, because pandemics might affect your business, but in fact, there are all these other ways in which these advances in biological technologies could advance your business. We think that's important. And of course, as an individual citizen, some of the other things that we discovered in our research around risks, will be part of the overall dialogue. The vaccines, for some reason are controversial, but understanding the facts, help us make those decisions as citizens in the public policy sphere, as well as professionals in our jobs. And so I do think what we've tried to uncover here from a future of work standpoint is the fact that, we'll all need to know a little more about biology too, if we're going to be effective going forward.
Final question for you, Michael, as you talk to your clients and the McKinsey talks to the big corporations you work with, what do you think it's going to take for people to essentially repopulate offices or go back to work? What are the things that the decision makers at the big global corporations are looking for? Are they waiting for a vaccine, or is it something short of that?
No, I don't think companies are just simply waiting for a vaccine. A vaccine would be terrific, and the sooner the better. But certainly, the same sorts of non-pharmaceutical interventions, right? So, wash your hands, wear a mask, and watch your distance. I think Tom Frieden, who used to be a CDC director, put it in those terms, thinking about spacing and processes and practices. There are a number of things you can do to enhance safety within the workplace, and so that can happen before we have safe and effective therapies and vaccines. Hopefully, we're going to science the heck out of all that stuff too, and try to make sure that we can have therapies and vaccines. But in the meantime, we also want to get the economy going again, and so I think it'll be a combination of those things. And we do see companies trying to be as thoughtful and make sure that the safety of their workers is possible. And many of us will continue to work from home, and that's the right thing to do for those of us who have the privilege to do that.
Yeah. It's been very heartening to see and hear the number of executives talking, leading with employee safety in their conversations, and as we've just done, concluding with employee safety. I want to thank Dr. Michael Chui. He's a partner at the McKinsey Global Institute, which is McKinsey's business and economics research arm. It's always a fascinating conversation, Michael. I look forward to our next virtual chat and hopefully seeing you in person sometime very soon.
Thanks, Stephanie, and thanks to the Asia Society.